everyone's got their own story, much like Miles Morales, and they have their own story to cut, and it's our charge to learn about them and get to know them before and after. Madison, how has your beginning to 2025 been?
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, let's see. I have, kind of a job. I have a hernia and I have a
Oh,
herniated disc in my back. And, I would love some health insurance.
yeah.
I was, excited almost for TikTok to die. It was really sad, but I was also excited about it because I was like, maybe this is the year I take my attention back.
Mm.
And I spent probably 30 minutes on TikTok this morning.
Yep.
So,
It comes right back. Yeah, having a cis, well, cut. Knowing someone who works there, I heard some interesting stories about how they weren't telling anyone they were closing, and they were like, "Just trust us, keep working, you'll see what happens." Now, there's like both sides of that. That could just mean that they didn't want everyone to quit,
yeah.
unnecessarily. The other side is it seems a little bit sketchy how it was only turned off for 12 hours, which is like the exact amount of time server migration takes between servers for all of your data.
Yeah.
Beyond conspiracies, either way, it's weird. And it's back. So I had full on deleted the app. I was like, we're done. I downloaded my videos. I'm just letting it be done. And like you, it came back, and I was like, well, in that case, let me just scroll for hours because I almost lost it. So
Yeah, I have to do it the hard way of like taking my attention back of just being like, okay, maybe we'll just do one thing at a time. Like maybe I don't need to be on Twitter. Maybe I just don't need to do that app.
I deleted it finally. Well, let's talk about something that distracts us from our distractions, which is movies.
Yeah.
We are back with another Sacred Text episode, and today we're digging into two that I love both of them. I think it's your first time seeing my movie, if I'm not wrong.
You are right.
But let's start with yours. Let's start with, you know what? No. You announce it. What is your Sacred Text for February?
My sacred text for February is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, which is the sequel. It's the follow-up to Into the Spider-Verse. It's the animated flick from Sony Animations. It is based on Spider-Man comics, based on Miles Morales, who's the alternate Earth version of Spider-Man, who is like a black Hispanic kid who gets bit by the spider instead of Peter Parker, or in addition to Peter Parker, and it's his adventures being Spider-Man.
Now, I know a lot of people usually like the first movie or the origin story more. What draws you to this sequel more than the first movie?
Dude, I don't know. I don't know. Like it's just like how do they just like do better than they did the first time? Like it's so rare that happens.
Yeah.
I don't know because the animation's pretty much the same. Yeah, so let's just like be clear about this movie. The animation is amazing. This is one of those first movies that started blending traditional 2D animation with 3D animation rather than just kind of this like the Pixarification of animated movies where it's like, oh, let's see how real we can get. Let's see how much we can like replicate real life in our three-dimensional modeling,
Yeah.
which is cool, I guess. But at some point, there's a diminishing returns where it's like, well, why don't you just like film something real? Like I'm thinking about like The Lion King. I'm just like, what is the point of this?
Yeah.
And but into the Spider-Verse, the first one was one of those first movies that was like, actually, animation itself is a beautiful medium, and we shouldn't be trying to recreate reality. We should be trying to like lean into the animation as an art form as much as possible. And so there's a lot of combination 2D with 3D, especially with like frame rates and animating on ones versus twos versus threes. And so let's just be clear that The animation is superb, and I think I remember Across the Spider Verse came out in the same year that The Boy and His Heron came out, which was a Ghibli film, and I know that The Boy and His Heron did win Best Animated Feature at the Oscars, and I remember thinking like, that's probably it probably deserves to win the award, but I was really sad that Across the Spider Verse did not win because of how amazing of a movie it is. Other reasons why I love this movie before we can get into the sacred text content is just like this is a movie that is, just like when we were talking about Dune 2 that came out earlier in 2024. This is a movie that just hits on every level, from animation to soundtrack to sound design to editing to character design to voice acting, like to cinematography, like everything hits, everything works. Like there's almost nothing to give notes on. The vibes are amazing. It's just an all around fantastic movie. I think I saw this like at least 4, maybe 5 times in theaters. And
Wow.
anytime I see a movie that many times in theaters, you know that like it has made an impact on me.
I mean, it's funny that you use the phrase very little to give notes on, knowing the backstory with the Lord Chris Miller and giving so many notes on it. But
Yeah.
regardless, this is a movie where it does seem to prove that the more you work at something and really just go over it 1,000 times over, it does get better because the choices in this movie and what they do, the plot itself, the art direction, the fight scenes, it feels intentional the entire way through. And like you're saying, it does not miss as you watch it. Let's talk a little bit about the sacred textness of it all and some of the motifs. I wrote down a couple different questions about Miguel O'Hara and the spot and some
Yeah.
of the themes, and Miles was never meant to be a Spider-Man. But first, let's talk about why to you, beyond it being a fantastic movie, why does it
Yeah.
resonate beyond the runtime?
Um, there's a lot of reasons why I think this one runs beyond it is a sacred text for me. And I think like it probably boils down to like 2 or 3 main reasons. One of them is that I love the idea of kind of multiversal selves because it is a way to tell archetypal stories that like, when we start talking about Spider-Man in a multiverse setting, and that's what we've been talking about over the last 5 years because, not only Sony but also Marvel made a multiversal Spider-Man movie, and it's kind of the name of comic games right now is multiverse movies, is that you get to not talk about the character is just like a normal character, but as a manifestation of an underlying archetype. And in the first one and Into the Spider-Verse, it was kind of this idea of like, well, can Miles be Spider-Man? Like, here are all the hallmarks of what it takes to be Spider-Man. Like, you gotta never give up. Like, Spider-Man always does this. Spider-Man always does this. And then it's a way of talking about the character from like 10,000 feet. And each character gets to be like a manifestation of this larger narrative. And then you get to see, how does this specific character match up to all the other characters? And it's a good way of kind of doing, like self-reflection. I mean, in kind of a mirror psychological sort of way, but also like, you can start asking questions of like, how does this character stand out from all the other ones based on their choices? And for me, I really like that because I love archetypes, so that's why we're doing this. And I love mythology, and I love using stories as narratives that I can see myself in, so that I can begin to ask myself introspective questions about how am I the best version of Madison? What version of Madison am I? If there's a multiverse full of Madisons out there, am I a mediocre Madison, or am I the worst version of Madison, or am I closer to like the Peter Parker of Madisons? So I love it on that level. On another level, I love it because I love the idea of canon events that because in the narrative of the story, there are these canon events that happen to Spider-Man, which is like, oh, he gets bit by a spider, he falls in love with Gwen Stacy, a police chief close to Spider-Man dies, Uncle Ben dies. These are all things that are always occurring in every Spider story in all of the Spider-Verse. And I think that the narrative in the movie doesn't necessarily portray the canon event as like it is pushing against the idea of canon events, but it's not necessarily saying that they're bad, because I think that we as humans also have canon events. And I know you and I grew up in a religious community that certainly had canon events of like,
Mhm.
when you turn 8, you get baptized. When you turn 12, you go on or you become like a young man, and then you go through seminary, then you go on a mission, you go to the temple, you get married, and all this stuff. And at some point, my life started to diverge from the canon events, and I certainly got a lot of cultural pushback because my life was diverging from canon. And I loved that idea in this movie of Miles Morales is the one who's trying to break canon. Although, although I also love the idea, Miguel O'Hara has a quote. He said, what did he say? He says, canon events are the connections that bind our lives together. And that's actually really a beautiful thing. And that's like how community is formed and like how friendships are made, is the canon events tie our life together. And so I love the idea of canon events. And that's, I think, a great mirror for me to like look in myself. And yeah, what else did I? Oh yeah, and I also, this is kind of tangentially related to the canon events, but I love the story of this one is that basically Miles isn't being Spider-Man in the right way, and that I one of the monkeys on my back is that I always feel like that no matter what I do, I'll always be on the outside of something. And that's kind of Miles's trip in this movie, is that he feels like he's on the outside of Spider Society, and that no matter what he does, he will always be on the outside. And that's something that I feel in my life a lot, is that no matter how well I do corporate job, I will always be on the outside. No matter how well I do boyfriend, I will always be on the outside. No matter how well I do, X, Y, or Z, I will always be on the outside. And so that part of the story really resonated with me, especially in the summer that this came out. But so yeah, that's kind of a start.
It's funny that you're bringing this up, especially with, I think, Google's Willow and people trying to say that it can prove the multiverse at some point or a parallel universe because how it demonstrates, you know, quantum systems or the potential of quantum systems to work. And I
Mm-hmm.
also think, like you're saying, us growing up in a not only a religious context, but an American story context of we absolutely love heroes' journeys. We thrive on them. We thrive on best and efficiency and best path. We have a mutual friend who I once got into a debate with about this, and he was just kind of saying to me that there is one best path, and if you're not doing that, you might be on a close branch, but there really is only one best path. And I feel like this movie
Mm.
really spits in the face of that idea and helps us to take more of a maybe an Eastern approach or just a more metaphysical approach, a more spiritual approach that says holistically, like you're saying, there may be canon events or there might just be life as it is to be lived, and it doesn't have to be a best or a have to. But like you, I love that this one was a lot about Miles saying, everyone keeps telling me how my story is supposed to go, but I want to do what I got to do. Like I've got my own gut sense and reality where I want to go with it. And he does kind of kick against these harder forces that are maybe acting out of their own traumas and regrets and griefs. What part of the movie for you is your favorite? I know people like battle scenes or like a speech here or there. What sticks out to you as like the emotional touch point?
I think the emotional core of the movie is that scene where, so basically the first 2/3 of the movie is Miles is chasing, wanting to become a member of Spider Society.
Yeah.
He is like doodling about his old multiverse friends and his books, and he's like, well, and for the last year I've been the only Spider-Man in my dimension, and
Hmm.
I've got all these friends, but they exist in other universes. And then Gwen Stacy comes back in to his universe, and he's like, wait, there's like more people. There's a whole thing. And he's like, I want to be included. Like, when is Miguel O'Hara going to give like Miles Morales a chance?
Hmm.
And so he's like just chasing belonging in this community, chasing it. And then finally he sneaks into the spider dimension, the spider society, and gets taken in to talk with Miguel O'Hara. And then he discovers that what the thing that he wanted is actually not the thing that he wanted.
Yeah.
And then he's got this. I mean, granted, it is kind of an exposition scene, but I think the whole scene with like, oh, we've got a sacred timeline, we've got canon events, and then you get to see all the other Spider-Man reacting to the fact like, wait, this happened to you? Like you lost your Uncle Ben? Like you had to have a police captain die in your arms? Like, and Miles is like, this happened to you? And they're like, yeah, what of it? Like, of course, like this is the thing that happens to all of us. And then having Miles have to put his life into the context of like not just the joys of being Spider-Man, but also like the lows of being Spider-Man as well. Because like the whole idea is like being Spider-Man is a sacrifice, and Miles' whole thing is like, no, I'm gonna have both. I'm gonna have my life, and I'm gonna have my cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what he's pushing against. And so that scene there where he's like, what is this, an intervention? Like I have to go back and like I can't just let my dad die. And then they trap him in kind of that energy field. And then Hobie, what a great character.
Great character.
Is like, he's like, use your palms, like get out of this thing and use your palms. And he's like instigating it from the inside. And then he blows the trap, and then, and then it's a chase scene. Like, I think that was the emotional core of the movie. And then of course, I think the real climax of the movie is him getting to the way home machine and then spiriting himself away from the Spider Society. Like, I think the last 20 minutes of the movie is really the first 20 minutes of the next movie. But yeah, I think that's kind of the emotional core for me of like Miles is like, oh, actually the thing that I wanted isn't the thing that I wanted, because like I don't fit in with the archetypes here. Like a lot of the people here are just like, well, Spider-Man has to suffer, so I guess I'll just accept my suffering. And Miles is wanting to push against that kind of structure, that narrative.
It is funny knowing each other, and for listeners who have picked up on enough, they know you enough now, how much of a Rorschach test that question became. And I was like, oh, well, what does this connect with medicine? The need for suffering and things that you want to have your cake and eat it too as well and cut your own path out of your own culture, as a lot of people do. And,
Yeah, dude. Although I will say, I I don't know what the sequel is going to do. Like, I don't know what the third one is going to do, because I
yeah,
think that telling a story of like, you can have your cake and eat it too, uh, is like, it's good,
yeah,
but I don't think it's going to be as narratively satisfying. That like Miles just like, he visits, he visits the dimension that, the other version of himself should have gotten bitten but never did, and then he just like goes home and he saves his dad, and that's the end of it. Like, I think
yeah.
that's too like, it's too cutesy. And so I
Hmm.
think it's going to get a little bit more complicated before it's done. But I will say that, like, the other level that I love these movies on is it's the persona versus shadow. It's a very Jungian, you know, lens, but you've got a secret identity and you've got your superhero identity, which is kind of a persona, which is the version of yourself you're showing to the world, and then your shadow, which is the part of yourself you don't want to show to the world. But then that gets like complicated even more by the idea that like Miles Morales is our version of Miles Morales is the version that got bit by the spider, and then he's got a version of himself that never did get bit by the spider and whose dad died. And that's his real shadow. Like, that's the shadow version of himself. And so the confrontation between his real self versus his shadow self in the next film is going to be phenomenal. Like, well, it has the recipe of being phenomenal, because I think I can't imagine that this film is going to like make, the Prowler version of Miles be a villain. They're going to show him being very complicated, that there are reasons why he's doing what he's doing. And even if he is really dark and villain like, he's more of an antagonist than an outright like mustache twirling villain. And I think that's really appropriate as you consider like shadow and persona. That your shadow's not, the idea is like, oh, we've got these things we don't like about ourselves, and the more we try and push them away from us, the worse off we're going to be. But the only pathway forward is through integrating those aspects of ourselves and expanding our sense of identity. And so I think, as we move into the future with this story, I think what they're going to be doing is having Miles expand his sense of self to include some of his shadow materials and trying to unify his identity between his Spider-Man persona and his Miles persona would be my guess.
Yeah, because the first film, Kingpin, is motivated by his grief and loss, which makes him create the Spider-Man version of Hadron Collider and everything else,
Yeah.
trying to bring them back. The second film is Miguel, motivated by grief and loss and what Spider-Man should be and everything else. So you're right.
Mm-hmm.
On the third one, it has to have something similar to hopefully close that arc up. But I'll tell you this, it's not even written yet. So, there are a lot of ways this story could
Fuck.
go. It'll be 2027 before we see this movie. So,
I hate that for everyone involved.
yeah. So, you know what? Maybe they'll listen to the pod and they'll make some changes. No. I trust where the movie's going. And I guess almost like the movie is saying, it's going to go wherever it's going to go, and we can't guide the path for how we think the story should end up. But I think, like you're saying, there's a lot of good elements there to dig deeper and have a much more interior look at, like you're saying, combining shadow with the self, dealing with the demons without having to be full on grief the whole time. So yeah, I'm excited, like you are. I'm excited to see how it
Yeah.
wraps up.
I would say for listeners, to really try and apply this movie to your own life is like, what are the canon events in your life path, from growing up? And, there's certainly some canon events in being an American, but, depending on your culture or where you come from, your canon events might look differently. And how does your own life path like align with those canon events, and how does it disalign with those canon events, and like what pushback have you gotten from the community that you belong to based on how your life is not aligned with canon events? Because I think that's one of the big takeaways from this for me is that breaking canon disrupts reality for those who are inside the canon, because they a lot of people went along with canon events or the status quo because they thought that they had to. And then to see people who are pushing against the canon events or pushing against the status quo because they see that they don't have to, can be really disruptive for people on the inside. And so, a good way of like making this movie a sacred text for you is to like look at what are the canon events in your life, and how are you aligning, not aligning with them, and like what are the reactions of people around you.
Beautiful. And I think for anyone who needs a little kick in the pants, you don't have to go read Kierkegaard, although it is great. But life must be lived forward and understood backwards, whether it truly be Kierkegaard or anybody else. It is a true idea. I know I've been reading a lot of Nietzsche recently, which colors the world a little
Mm.
differently. But he had a quote that I loved that I had written down in thinking of this movie where he talks about there's one path in the world that none can walk but you. And where does it lead? Don't ask, walk. And so what he talks about, like, there's one path that
Mm.
no one else but you can walk. It doesn't mean that it's predetermined exactly what the path is. It's just whatever your path that you're walking becomes, it is what you decide to make it. So I think that in combination with your charge to look back at canon events and what could have been done differently, and either way, hope everyone takes a little moment to, like you said, reflect and look at life and the path we're on.
Liken the scriptures.
I was watching this movie and I was like, this is just Madison's Spider-Verse consciousness. It's just Christ consciousness, but Spider-Man. That's all it
It
is.
is. Yeah, actually, that's really potent. Instead of Christ consciousness, it's spider consciousness. It's the
Mm-hmm.
polyarachnoid humanoid universe.
I was like, you could become the Richard Rohr Spider-Man. There is
Yes,
a
I can do
lane
that.
there.
Sure. Yeah.
Any last thoughts before we move on to the second movie of our week?
Nope. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it and talk about how I cried.
Me and Earl and the Dying Girl. Yeah, before I give anything, tell me about your emotions during this movie. And did you watch a trailer? Were you prepared at all?
Yeah, I watched the trailer and then I was like, yeah, I feel like I remember seeing this trailer once upon a time. I was like, wow, Olivia Cook. I didn't realize she was that young, because I see her in House of the Dragons. And she just seems like an adult to me. When did the movie come out? Like 10 years ago? Had to have been.
2015, yeah.
Anyways, yeah, dude, I don't know. There's just movies where I go into it, I'm like, this is gonna make me cry. And it did.
And it did. There are people in my life who have not cried in 10 plus years, and they bragged about it. And I was like, well, buckle up and sit down. And this has a pretty good hit rate as far as bringing the emotions out. Now, not that I'm always looking for that, but I have had it called out by future in-laws. They're like, why do some white people just love to watch movies that make them sad? And I was like, I don't think it's just white people, but also that is a good call out of like, perhaps it's Western society and our need to feel like there's a reason to be vulnerable and emotional. And maybe that's what it was at that time in
I
my
mean, I've
life.
got some theories. I got some theories. Maybe we can talk about that.
Okay. Me and Earl and the Dying Girl, a 2015 indie movie directed by Alfonso Gomez Rejon. The screenplay is written by Jesse Andrews, and it is based on a book from 2012, which the writer of the book, Jesse Andrews, also wrote the screenplay. I love when that happens. So it's the story of a 17-year-old named Greg Gaines, who's a senior at a high school in Pittsburgh. He avoids close attachment to anybody else. He brags about how he moves between all the social circles until his mom says, there's a girl in your grade who's just been diagnosed with leukemia. You need to go make friends with her. Her name is Rachel. And Greg's kind of like, I kind of know of her. We have a flashback of him saying some shitty things to her on accident. And he befriends this girl, but the friendship is not how we normally see friendship. It doesn't come about in the same way, but it gets cuter as the movie goes on to where you see he opens up more. He finally becomes a little more vulnerable. But he warns you it's about the dying girl. Like, she will die. Like, don't get too attached.
No, he does the opposite of that.
And
He
then at a
gaslights
certain
us.
point, he gaslights and goes, don't worry, I know you're attached. Now don't worry, she's going to be fine. And it's such a heartbreaking moment. So for everyone listening, trust the title. Just trust the title. We're going to, you know what, this is not spoiler free. We're going to talk about it. She definitely dies in the movie. But I think the 10 to 15 minutes of film after she dies, to me, is one of my favorite bits in all these sacred text movies, just for how it portrays the emotions, what it does, and how it
Mm.
shows it to the audience and allows us to like fill in the gaps. It's not full of dialogue, it's not full of text. It's all show, not tell. And I think it's just a great movie about the difficulties of high school, the difficulties of being vulnerable, the difficulties of growing up and trying to find your way and being frustrated and having someone close to you die and getting closer to them right before they die and kind of the feelings of guilt and questioning your role in it afterwards. So tell me, you watched the trailer, you sat down. Were you engaged? You said you weren't distracted too much during the movie, right?
No, like I didn't even take notes. I tried. I think the one note that I took was, am I in love with Olivia Cook?
Oh my gosh. Get in line. There's a lot of folks who
Um,
are on the same train.
yeah, I think that was the one note that I took, but then I just kind of got swept up into the movie. And I think because with these other movies, like I've seen them before. And so I know what to expect. So I can write notes pretty easily. But like if I've never seen the movie before and it's engaging, my
Yeah.
ability to take notes is pretty swamped. But pretty early on in the movie, it's pretty easy for me to identify with the main character, Greg, because
Mhm.
I took a pretty similar path in high school where I was like, I don't belong anywhere because I belong everywhere, and I have membership in all the cliques, but I'm not deep membership. I have very shallow membership in all the groups. And so when he was like, "Yeah, this is my way of getting through is that I belong nowhere," I'm like, "Oh shit, yeah, same, dude, same." And there's just a montage of him having very minimal interactions with just everyone. I'm like, oh, I did those things. I don't know if I did them as consciously as defense mechanisms, but with hindsight, like, yeah, there was some defense mechanisms going on. So yeah, I resonate with the main character.
And Thomas Mann, who got us real start from this movie. Has appeared in a handful of things. You know, he was in King Kong years ago. We actually screened a movie with him when we first started at the other magazine called Some Freaks. Did you watch that with me?
I don't think I did.
You
Maybe
might
I
not have
did.
been there, actually. Okay, I know I had screened that movie. He was in Kong Skull Island and one of the Amityville movies, The Highwaymen, Them That Follow, which I absolutely love that movie. Marcel in the Shell, Parachute, Project X, Dose. He's been in some TV stuff. Anyways, he more just likes filming weird stuff. He's just a little different. And I think that for
Yeah.
me, the whole way this movie and the book that came first, it's not that it was written or produced just to challenge coming of age stories. I think
Hmm.
instead it was to write a story that's not usually told about coming of age, of this loner who's kind of scared. It's unconventional. There's not a conventional romance between Greg and Rachel. They're not falling
Hmm.
in love. They're not making out. There's no sex scene. None of that stuff. She literally has leukemia and is dying. And he's like, well, my mom's making me hang out with you. So here we are. And I think it's sweet in that way of not playing into the stereotypes that maybe would have gotten a more popular acclaim. But this was a Sundance award winning movie. It got the Grand Jury Prize for drama. It got the Audience
Hmm.
Award for drama. So 2015 at Sundance, people were loving this movie. This was their jam. Which is why, at least in Utah, this played for like 2 months at theaters because I saw it 5 times in the theaters in
Wow.
2015. I took everyone that I knew that I could take with me, and then I pre ordered the poster, I pre ordered the DVD. I was so addicted, it was a little unhealthy. But my fiance met the producer for this film at a Northwestern event, and the producer said, of all the movies that I've ever worked on, this is my crowning achievement. This is my favorite movie.
Wow.
This is the one that I think people will look back at and rewatch for generations and feel something. And having watched it and loved it, I'm like, oh, you did it, lady. You did it.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Interesting.
All that to say, this movie has a lot of emotions in it and avoiding emotions. I love that Greg is a great archetype for anyone who is so scared of the potential of being hurt that they'll avoid emotional intimacy at all costs,
Hmm.
much to their detriment. And I think we see a ton of that, and we have for generations in all of humankind. You'll see a lot of it. But I think the way in which this was portrayed was great, and I think that it plays into that final message so well because by finally allowing yourself to be hurt and not being a narcissist and saying it's all about yourself, but just allowing yourself to feel, there's so much more love at the end of the road that opens up that, like John Bernthal's character says, even when someone dies, it doesn't mean you have to stop getting to know them or getting to love them. And that you can
Hmm.
learn about someone's life and unlock more stories in the depth of your love for them even after they pass. And that's such an interesting, unique human thing on this planet to be able to do that.
Yeah. I think the because filmmaking is a part of this movie.
Yeah.
It's a little meta where Greg and Earl, their whole gimmick is that they're not friends, they're business partners. And their business is like making these really silly spoof movies of like other movies like A Clockwork Orange, these really like highbrow academic foreign films that almost no one has heard of. And they make really dumb spoofs of them. And he's like, "Oh, this is formula for making really bad movies, but that's fine. That's what we're doing." And so how do you feel like that works as like a narrative device within the movie? Because, they could have done anything, but they chose to make a movie about a kid who makes movies who has struggles to be vulnerable.
I feel like it was the perfect story element and show not tell device to explain Greg and navigating the world around him. Because he loves all these movies he's watching, he appreciates them, but he doesn't want to be cliche and be the guy who likes odd, weird old movies. And so the way in which he shows his love is by doing a cheeky, bad remake of it in which he is imitating the art that he now has fallen in love with, but doing it in a way that it's like, oh, but you can't say that I'm being genuine or vulnerable or like
Mm-hmm.
really expressing my love. You can't even make fun of the fact I like these movies because I'm making fun of them in a way with my movies. And at least for me, that's how I felt like the movies played into this is that Earl is his coworker. It's not his friend. You know, everyone else is an acquaintance. No one's allowed to see these movies. Even his dad, who really loves them, is not allowed to watch them. And Greg is pissed that his dad's been watching them while he's been gone. And Greg's just pissed that anyone knows his true feelings or even his attempt at kind of showing him off. So, and I love all the names. The names are great when they go through all those little posters and stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, a box of lips. Wow, was my fiance's favorite. She was like, "That's just too good." Anatomy of a burger, crouching house cat, hidden house cat, nose ferret too. You know, mono rash, the janitor of Oz, pooping Tom, senior citizen Kane, Sockworch Orange was great. The Seven Seals I loved.
It makes sense why in the narrative. So Greg struggles to do anything that he isn't pushed into doing by the people around him, whether that's befriending Rachel because his mom forces him to do that, or showing Rachel his movies, which Earl forces him to do that,
Yeah.
to making a movie for Rachel, which Madison, the character Madison, does for him. But it explains why making the movie for Rachel is such a difficult task for him because it
Yeah.
requires genuineness in a way that he's not used to, because he's used to standing behind a guarded wall of irony, and that's a remove, and to be able to make something that is genuine and heartfelt requires completely different muscles.
Which I love that we see in the way that he's making that movie because he's like interviewing people and getting all these honestly glib responses of like, "Hey, I know God has a plan for you. Hang in there, buddy. I know you got
Mm-hmm.
this." And like he's hating it because he knows it's not real the whole time he's doing it. So yes, I do love that it forces him to be vulnerable. And what did you think of that film he makes at the end?
I don't know, I only saw half of it
Oh,
because
through teary eyes.
she freaking dies.
She freaking dies.
She dies in the middle of it. I mean, right when, so in the beginning, the opening like narration, he's like, this is a story about a movie that I made that was so bad it killed someone. And then
Yeah.
you just forget about that. You just forget about it. And then you're sitting there and, it's cute. He put the corsage on her arm and they're watching the movie. And I'm like, uh-oh, uh-oh.
Yeah.
This movie was so bad it killed someone. And then something happens and she like turns and looks at him with like panic in her dead eyes. And then I'm like, oh shit, this is it. Like she's gonna die. She's not gonna rally and like give him a kiss. This is it.
Yeah.
And then so you only get to see like half of his movie while nurses start running in, and then it's just a soundtrack played over him watching this thing happen while his thing is being projected on him in the wall. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, I can't watch this.
Yeah, that sound that's playing during the film, I absolutely love from Brian Eno called The Big Ship. And it's such an interesting instrumental, very
Mm-hmm.
electronic-y, synths and whatever else. I remember the first time I saw it, I was just kind of like sitting there watching it quizzically, like, what is this song? What is this film? It's all stop motion. What does it mean?
Mm-hmm.
There's like these little triangles and trapezoids kind of flying across the paper and growing and building. And I think the first time I was a little taken back because I was just overwhelmed with emotion and confused. Then the next four times I saw it in theaters over the next 2 weeks, it became more and more beautiful the way the music played with it, and that they didn't show you the entire film. It's not like they took the audience out and said, "Okay, now you're just going to see what they're seeing."
Mm-hmm.
It's experiencing the whole time that Greg has made something raw and emotional that is a vibe and a feeling. And Rachel's sitting there just expecting, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna die soon." He's made a movie finally, this asshole, he's here to visit me. Okay, fine. And then what we kind of see is this emotional interchange and exchange of, "I don't know, but I have feelings and I care about you." That's what this looks like. And I think they could have done it so many different ways. At least for me, the best way, the most poignant way. And it doesn't have to make sense to everybody. And I think that's also important in this story, that the way he feels for her doesn't make sense to most of the kids at school. Everyone's either
Yeah.
saying he's capitalizing on the fact she's dying, or he finally has a friend, or oh, your girlfriend. He's like, she's not my girlfriend. And he struggles to say friend. And I think finally, when
Mm-hmm.
we get to the funeral, he has that moment of peace rather than being so fidgety and scared. And what does everyone think of? I'm going to sit with my emotions. I'm going to go upstairs. And then I want to know your feelings on him in her bedroom and kind of learning about her as she's just passed.
I think early in the movie, you really get a sense that this kid is also pretty selfish. He's pretty
Yeah.
self-centered.
Yeah.
He's only doing things because he's forced into doing it. And then he also, not only that, but he's telling the people around him as a way of keeping them at a distance, right? That
Hmm.
like, hey, I'm just here because my mom wanted me to be here.
Yep.
Or later in the movie, when she's like, hey, I'm going to stop doing treatments, he's like, have you even thought about how this would impact me?
Yeah.
Have you even thought about how this would impact your mom? Like, you're so selfish. And I'm just like, bro, this
You
isn't
are so
about you.
selfish.
This is not about you.
Yeah.
And like the moment you realize that this isn't about you is when you can finally like sink into people as people. And so I think that scene where, he goes upstairs into a room and finds finds the letter, the little note that she wrote him, and reads that in her
Mhm.
room. Oh my gosh, so
So
tearful.
good. Yeah.
But then also looks around her room. He finally like sees her as a person, and like they're, the little diorama art cut things that she was doing in all the books.
Yeah.
Like we didn't even know that she was doing that the entire time.
No.
And it's like, did Greg know that she had that talent, that skill? Like probably not.
No.
Which means that Greg's relational capacity up until this moment has been so surface level. It has been so about him, and having this experience is like, oh, there's a lot more to her going on with her than like I understood. And then like tracing, the squirrel through her wallpaper and then into the
Mhm.
book, and then just like it helped kind of unravel the like, oh, there's a lot more going on here than Greg like realized and understood. Yeah.
It was honestly painful to kind of come to terms with that part of the story, at least for me, the first few times, because it's realizing that, yes, the selfish, emotionally hurt, or scared asshole had been
Mm-hmm.
breadcrumbed the whole story like we did as the audience. Because we hear on their walk when he finally asks her a question. And she says, "Oh, my dad and I used to go walk into the neighborhood and counting squirrels." Okay, there's no follow up. There's nothing about it. He doesn't do anything cute about that or ask or dig in or make a movie about squirrels. He just goes cool and moves on. Molly Shannon, who is Rachel's mom in this movie, says at one point early on that when they got the divorce, Rachel just took scissors to all of his books. She loved to snip, 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 snip. And as an audience, none of us asked that question further, like Greg doesn't, of like, okay, so what became of that
Mm-hmm.
snipping in the books and everything else? And so it's fun to kind of take yourself out for a second and go, Greg's the main character, but we're all our own main character. And if we don't ask those questions, we don't know, and we don't know someone deeper. And for
Mm-hmm.
him to have this identity as, I make films, no one else can see them, it's my artistic thing, it's very special. And then to realize the whole time he's never even asked what she likes to do. And for her talent to be so artistic and so beautiful and unique in
Mm-hmm.
what she's doing, it is that moment that kind of makes you realize, like, oh, how many other people in my life just need to be asked a question, who have
Yeah.
something they need to be sharing, or that I would love to know about them before they pass. To find out some other part of somebody, like I met someone at a networking event who talked about how their grandmother had helped sew costumes for Hollywood, and they had no idea. She was just like a
Oh, wow.
housewife doing something that's like, oh, this was a completely different hobby and part of her life that you never knew about. This is a chance to kind of learn about it. So I
Mm-hmm.
think, dear listener, and for everyone who watches this movie, it's a great reminder that people are so multifaceted and there's so many deep and dark and beautiful parts that we just don't know about unless we spend the time to be vulnerable, to love them, to get to know them. And everyone's got their own story, much like Miles Morales, and they have their own story to cut. And it's our charge to learn about them and get to know them before and after they pass.
What are your thoughts on why do we like sad movies? I don't know if it's just a white person thing. I think it's a human thing.
It's a
Why do we
human
like
thing.
sad stories?
I think for me, it is an opportunity to interact with your own emotions through a different story. I think it could be
Mm-hmm.
too depressing and dark for most people to sit down with a journal and a giant piece of banner paper to draw the timeline of their life and go, what happened to me? Why am I the way I am? Why do I struggle to make connections? Why am I having a hard time at work? Why am I really good at basketball? And to like really ask
Hmm.
those questions is difficult. I think film, like literature, like art, as it all is art, it's the most beautiful mirror in that it's not about us, but it's all about us. And I
Yeah.
think, at least for me, when watching movies, like we watched Tree of Life last month, it's such a beautiful moment to see something else and learn about yourself in a very different way.
Yeah.
What about you? I mean, what do you enjoy about movies like this?
I mean, I think, what is it, Plato that talked about catharsis? That
Mhm.
like that's the point of a story, is that it helps us navigate our own emotions. And you're right. You and I both know that most people don't want to look inside.
Yeah,
They just don't want to do it. And and not I don't want to look inside all the time. I don't want to like just be a navel gazer, but I know that it's something that I'm not afraid to do, and I'm not afraid to really take stock of my emotional landscape around stuff. But I also know that like that's not everyone's forte, and like we need stories to help us achieve catharsis, which is a catharsis is like a resolution, an emotional resolution. I know this is certainly the case for me, is that sometimes I need help accessing certain emotions because I can't just like feel angry. I don't know how to
Mhm.
do that. I don't know how to which, and dear listener, you just learned something about me.
You have to get mad.
I struggle to feel angry about literally anything. And so sometimes I need a story to help me feel that emotion so that I can get in contact with it. And because sadness is like an emotion we're reluctant to feel, we need a movie to help us feel it so that once we feel it, we can then sit in it and we can experience it in a safe way, in a safe context, right? Because like, in real life, if I had a friend who died from cancer like this would be not just emotionally devastating, but it would be traumatic. It would be life impacting in a really big way. But to
Yeah.
watch it happen on screen is a way for me to engage with that context and that story in a safe way so that I can learn something, so that I can grow and I can actually like change, but do it in a way that isn't going to actually traumatize me.
When people talk about therapy and why our parents' generation and even people now hate therapy or don't want to do it, it's because it's just talking about yourself and they're not offering anything other than just being a listening ear. I think that's the problem is so many people are scared of that listening ear hearing them and understanding them. I
Hmm.
have this theory and I'd love to write a little more about it one day of more than being just loved, humans want to be understood. At the
Yeah.
same time, we hate anyone knowing everything about us and truly understanding us. Because, like you said, it's the shadow and the self at the same point. It's such a scary intersection right there. And I think movies allow you to be able to negotiate the feelings and the story of your life with something else.
Hmm.
Me and Earl and the Dying Girl. Folks, she dies. You know about it. She dies. Keep a box of tissues nearby. Don't be unprepared.
Don't be prepared, especially when Greg starts gaslighting you and saying, guys, she gets better at the end, just so you know. He's lying to you.
Can we talk about for 2 seconds John Bernthal and
Yeah.
him as the teacher, mentor, sage? First off, I just love his respect the research in class. To me, I'm like, that's the teacher I would have loved to be. That's the
Yeah.
kind of teacher I loved in school. But his kind of cool fontsness that is then directly sat right next to his emotional depth and talking about his father and the
Hmm.
stories he hears at the funeral. We're going to hit on it later in a series we're teasing, but he is a great archetype, at least for me, of what masculinity can look like. In that
Yeah.
you have to have the full breadth of emotions. You can love history. You can also love your dead father's funeral and learning things about him and being emotional. And those
Hmm.
things are not contradictory. I just love his character in this movie.
Yeah, it's a good one. I'm like, oh, every coming of age story has like a cool teacher that serves as the wise sage.
Yeah,
Even Booksmart. Booksmart does.
that's
We'll talk
true.
about now. I want to just like do an archetype series of just like going through all of our favorite like wise sage. Because now I'm just thinking about Surfs Up and Big Z's character, because he is the wise sage in that movie, and his weird like way of approaching. Anyways,
Yep, yep.
anyways,
All right, Sacred Text, we did it again. Movies and
cool.
emotions, all in one episode.
All in one episode.
Where did you watch Me and Earl and the Dying Girl?
Hulu.
It
It's
is
free on
on
Hulu.
Hulu. I have the DVD. It's on Hulu, and Across the Spider-Verse is on Netflix to stream. We hope everyone enjoyed today's episode. We hope you think about your own sacred texts and what they mean to you. Let us know in the comments or our DMs or email us if there's a movie you'd like to see covered or if you want to talk about what we've talked about today. And until next week, watch good movies and TV.